Hello and welcome to the fourth Listen and Learn podcast, brought to you by Volunteer Services at Hospice of Central Ohio. We're delighted to have chaplains Daniel Fullen and Bob Coberly with us today, two of our three full-time chaplains who provide spiritual support to our patients and their families. For the first half of this podcast, we'll be talking with Daniel. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you for having me here today, Liz. It's a delight to share and to talk about what chaplains add to the hospice care and how spiritual care is an important part of end-of-life care.
Wonderful. Let's begin at the beginning, certainly with you. If you would be willing, say a little bit about how you became interested in becoming a chaplain first, and then what drew you into your chaplaincy in an end-of-life care setting.
It's been an interesting journey for me. I responded to a calling to ministry at a very young age and began pastoring when I was 19. Served a couple different churches, one my home church, and then I served a church in the Dayton area. I was out there for about 6 years, and during that period of my ministry, I was also working through my seminary classes and needed an additional ministry experience in fulfilling some of the requirements there. So I had enrolled in a CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education program, through one of the local hospitals in Dayton. And quite honestly, I thought, this is not something that I'm going to enjoy. This is not, what I perceived as my calling. I was, content in what I was doing in the church. But soon really grew into that role as a chaplain in the hospital setting. Ended up spending a couple years there, working through both an internship as well as a residency. And finished up there, and then it was kind of in a time of discernment and trying to figure out, okay, now, where am I going with this, and how this is going to either impact my ministry in the church, or if this will lead me, to some unique ministry outside of the church. And soon I ended up continuing to pastor in the church. Started working as a PRN chaplain for Hospice of Dayton.
Okay.
And as I grew into that role, I found that I enjoyed even more so hospice chaplaincy versus what I had experienced in the hospital setting. And primarily, what I saw as kind of the difference between the two was with hospice, I was able to journey with people, whereas in the hospital, often I would, see folks and see them one time, and by the next day or before the day was even over, they were gone, and I never learned quite, how their story ended. And so it was neat to, with hospice, to have that opportunity to spend some time with not only with patients but also with their family, their caregivers, those who were part of their circle of love, and to to kind of stand back and to witness all of that happening as well, and be invited into the circle and to be a part of it. And so from there, as I continued exploring where God was leading me, and came to a point in my ministry in the church where I was feeling it was time to make some changes there and to move on, and so at just the right timing, Hospice of Central Ohio had posted a full-time position, which also brought me back closer to home as well, my home being Circleville. So it's also brought me back nearer to family. And it all came together at the right time and God's timing, and I'm very much happy to be a part of the team here at Hospice of Central Ohio, and have really found myself just kind of pulled into this role, and this is where God has led me and where He is using me.
Well, no doubt in all of the time that transpired from when you were 19 to just this present day, I have no doubt that you've collected a lot of stories and that you've experienced so many different facets of the work that we do. I also know that there's a lot of mythology about what we do. We've addressed some of that in previous podcasts, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more from your experience about the role of the chaplain at end of life and what some people's misconceptions are about what we do to support people's spiritual needs at end of life.
And you're exactly right. Liz, I've collected lots of stories and just the little time that I've been at work at this, and it often at times it amazes me sometimes the responses that I initially get when I am calling on particularly new patients and families and introducing myself as the chaplain. Some of the I call it kind of pushback sometimes. Sometimes it's a challenge to get in the door. And as I've thought about some of those reasons and some of the things that people might be thinking, or have even kind of put out there point blank, this is how we're feeling, this is why we don't want you here. One of the first myths that I would put on my list that often people will say, we don't need you right now. And usually what they mean by that is that they feel that I'm coming there because I'm dying. And I often I in a general way try to remind people and that that's not why I'm there. As I perceive hospice care as a whole, I see dying as secondary.
Interesting.
I mean, yes, that's part of what we are dealing with. It's the ultimate outcome of what's going to happen. But I see myself more in terms of coming in there to support the living rather than the dying. And so once I can kind of work past what people may be thinking, I'm not there because you're dying, but rather I'm there because I'm interested in listening and learning your story and to celebrate that story with you and what has been valuable and meaningful in your life. And Liz, another one of the the myths that I would kind of draw out that often I see is oftentimes people, they think that I'm there to preach at them, to tell them what I think they should believe, or they will think that I'm there to tell them that they should be going to church, or to condemn them if they haven't been going to church. It's interesting. Every now and then I'll go into some of those initial visits, and people, they'll start off and they'll say, well, I've been thinking about going to this church down the street, and I just haven't taken that step. And often I have to kind of stop them there and say, that's okay, because one, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this probably isn't the time to to begin thinking about going to church, if that's
exactly.
But also just to kind of remind them that that's not why I'm there. Another little phrase that sometimes I'll use with people to kind of soften that, and so they see that I'm not there with a a judgmental agenda, is I will say to them, as I see it, one of the joys in my role as a chaplain, as a hospice chaplain, is that I'm able to bring a little bit of church to you when you're no longer able to to get to church physically. And so then it kind of they begin to see that, okay, it's okay if I haven't been to church on Sunday. It's okay if I haven't been to church in many years. And then again, to kind of draw it back to where I'm interested in not pushing my agenda, but drawing out your story. And sometimes there's good reasons that they haven't been to church in a number of years, and
right.
As we all know, unfortunately, the church isn't a perfect place, and it can be hurtful as well, and so sometimes there's some things behind that, and there may be things that they're trying to work through, and just to find healing, and that's more of what I would be interested in exploring with them, rather than saying they should or shouldn't be doing certain things, but to look at why where those statements come from when they bring it up.
So Daniel, I know we are a regulated environment. How does it feel to be providing spiritual care within that framework? Does it seem counterintuitive, or does the fact that Medicare, and this is kind of a loaded question, Medicare requires that our chaplains make contact within 5 days of admission, and we do that. That doesn't mean that the patient necessarily has to accept your support as you described, but how does it feel to be providing what can be some really personalized care at a spiritual level to folks within that regulatory framework? Because we're required to offer it.
I know one of the things I've always kind of, especially early on, would really struggle sometimes with those challenges, particularly the 5-day rule.
Mm-hmm.
That within 5 days, the patient and family, they should be hearing from each of the disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Chaplain being one. And then often what I would find is I would contact people, and sometimes they would be overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
They've heard from the nurse by this point in time. A social worker has called on them. An aide may have been in the home 2 or 3 times already, and
Right.
and they have all these people plus not to mention the admission staff getting it all set up, and here's one more person calling.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the ways I've learned to kind of work with that while at the same time
Mm-hmm.
honoring the the regulations that are in place is usually I will call, and I will begin by just saying I'm just calling today to introduce myself,
Mm-hmm.
to let you know that I'm part of the team. You don't have to have me come today. We can set up a time the next week or
Mm-hmm.
two if that's more comfortable, be more convenient for you, give you some time to to think about
Right.
what your needs are. One of the other things that I have learned through my work with hospice is also I have found that it's important that the chaplain, even if they say no, that the chaplain still make one contact with them.
Mm-hmm. And why is that?
One of the things I picked up early on was, the question would come up at admissions often that, would you like a chaplain or something, just kind of
Mm-hmm.
introducing a chaplain as part of the team. And sometimes, people would give one answer, whether it be
Mm-hmm.
yes or no. And then I would see this pattern that the next day or two, a nurse or social worker would come into the home, and the question would come up again about a chaplain, and the answer would be different.
Huh.
And so that then got me to thinking, okay, one, do they want me or do they not want me?
Right.
So then part of my role, I thought, well, maybe it's good just out of practice, whether they say yes or no,
Mm-hmm.
I will still call them, to introduce myself to them.
Mm-hmm.
So at least they have a name, they have a voice, they know that I am part of the team. They know that I'm available, even if they're saying no right now. The days go by, or the weeks,
Mm-hmm.
months. If suddenly there's a change and they decide,
Mm-hmm.
maybe we would like to talk to someone, they know that I'm available. And so I think people, I think too, when the question comes directly from the chaplain,
Mm-hmm.
their response sometimes is different.
Mm-hmm.
At least gives them opportunity to think about.
Mm-hmm.
To think about what might be their own spiritual needs, and to know that this is an important person who is also part of the team,
Mm-hmm.
that is available to help them address those needs.
Right. Right. And you may have answered that, but I'm going to turn the question in a different direction. Why is the spiritual aspect of end-of-life care so important for us to regulate? I mean, Medicare thought it was important enough to require it. We certainly treat it, even if Medicare didn't require it, as something that we would offer anyway. So as you maybe think of in a big picture way, when we look at people at end of life and all the things that they're experiencing, what is it about the spiritual aspect of that experience that's so important for us to tend to?
When I think of spirituality and spiritual care, one word that I often comes to my mind is connections. And I think in the spiritual realm of things, that's often what we're dealing with, is the connections. Not only the connection to to God or their higher power, but the connections as well to again those people that are around them.
Mm-hmm.
Connections to whatever's been meaningful in their life. It could be connections to their career, their work,
Right.
their hobbies.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is it's been an important and vital part of their life story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whereas from the medical side of things, we can come in and we can treat this illness. We can see the signs and symptoms that are there. We can address the pain by medicating.
Right.
But some of that pain can also stem from those connections.
Mm-hmm.
Where the connections have been strong, and maybe they're not as strong now. Things that have been broken.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where kind of the spiritual side of things come into, addressing. Maybe there's pieces within their story that they're trying to reconcile within themselves.
So Daniel, I know that part of doing this in a regulated environment requires that we kind of broaden our view. And I think for some of our patients, the word religion, the word spirituality could come to mean different things. And I'm wondering if you could describe or explain for yourself what the distinction is between religion and spirituality, because we've, up to this point, been talking spiritual care, and I think that's intentional.
I think that's a great question, Liz, because again, as we navigate some of those myths and misperceptions of how people view chaplains and spiritual care, you've got to begin by distinguishing that there is a difference between spiritual and religious.
Mm-hmm.
And often I find that it's the religious piece that people are pushing against or push back on. The religious is more of the kind of the cut and dry. I see it as more kind of the rigorous your list of rules. These are the things that we do. These are the things that we don't. These are the things that we practice. The religious is more in lines of going to church is often what people will think of in terms of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people say I'm not a church-going person, and they use that as kind of the reason for not having the chaplain come in. So whereas religion may be what the person is actually rejecting when they're rejecting my services.
Mm-hmm.
And yet if I can bring that back to them that it's not about religion, but it's about spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
As I've talked about how I kind of define spirituality in terms of connections. And so all of life in that regards is spiritual.
Right.
And whereas not every person may be a religious person, every person deep down is a spiritual person.
Mm-hmm.
And when they learn that I can come in there, we can have a conversation. We don't even have to talk about God or bring God's name into the conversation.
Right.
And yet we can draw out the spirituality as we talk about those relationships. Those things have been important to them. A good story that I can share that's helped me to kind of, as a chaplain, to remind myself that what I'm doing is spiritual care and not religious in nature. When I was during my residency at the hospital in Dayton, there was a patient there who was there for an extended period of time, and she was known for this phrase that as soon as a chaplain would walk into her room and introduce themselves as a chaplain, she would just kind of hold up her hand and stop him right there and say, "I don't feel very religious today." And that was her cue for that chaplain to turn around and walk back out of the room. And so this had been shared with me by several of the different chaplains, and even in kind of a warning sense, you might not even want to go by her room because that's what she's going to say to you. And so one day I had worked up the courage and was going down the hall where she was at, and I decided I'm not going to skip over her room. I'm going to stop in her room just as I'm stopping in every room, introducing myself. And so I walked into her room, and sure enough, she held up her hand. She gave me the response, "I don't feel very religious today." I'm not sure why I responded back to her this way, but I said, "Well, that's okay, because I don't feel very religious today either."
Good one.
And from there, she kind of paused a moment, and she opened up to me and gave me the okay that it was okay to sit down, spend a few minutes with her. soon as she began to open up to me and became more comfortable with me, she had shared with me about this horrible story of how when she was young her brother had committed suicide, and the church had condemned him and told her that they were certain that her brother is now in hell because he committed suicide. And that's the religious piece. That was the piece that she was rejecting. That was the piece where she was hurt. And that was where my work then began with her, to help her to set that religious piece aside and look at the spiritual side of things, and how can we reconcile that? How can we find healing for that? And I hope and pray that after spending some time with her that day, and it seemed to give her some comfort just talking to me, opening up with her story. I wasn't there to push religion. I was there to support her and to be understanding of how she was feeling, and to understand what was behind that initial response. And so I walking out of the room, I hope and pray that she that her spiritual side of things was cared for, and that the religious side of things can be set aside.
What a beautiful and powerful story, not just about the distinction, but about the ways that we help, and I guess I want to use this word gently, we facilitate an individual's ability to find meaning and purpose in his own life, in her own life, through that spiritual support that is non-judgmental, that is not threatening, that doesn't come with an agenda. Everything that I have heard and seen and experienced about hospice, not just from being employed there, but as a family member too, affirms that, is that that's the role that we play in spiritual care. And so here's this woman who was holding on to some pain, and there was no pill for it. There was you in a way that she was able to receive. And so whatever it was that led you to respond, I'm not feeling very religious today either, might have dispelled in a tiny way, a myth, or put a crack in that defensive barrier that she had created for herself. Wow. So here we are finding different ways to bring meaning and purpose, or to at least unlock that with people. And I can only imagine what other stories you have that point to that. How else do we do that for people? What are some other ways that we're able to allow them to release some burdens, or to climb out from underneath whatever weight they're under?
And I think too, it comes back to the importance of just being there, not taking offense at some of the statements that will come from people, and being willing to keep going back. I think when they then learn that that you do come in a non-threatening manner, and that even though they are saying they don't need you or rejecting you for whatever reason, I keep going back and making it known to them that I'm available, and when they're ready as well to open up, that invitation is always there.
And what a way to honor. You had used early on in our conversation the word journey. And so there's very little that I've experienced that's clutch type linear about the hospice experience, about the end-of-life experience. It spirals around, it returns back to things, even though the general overall progression is toward what we know is inevitable. But you had also said something about that I'm just being there, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more, or a lot more, about the value of simply being present. I think it's something that I know I could struggle with at times. I feel a tendency to want to be doing something, but the act of being with someone is sometimes more what they need and more powerful. And what does the act of being and presence look like in your work, Daniel? What does that look like?
Yes, just that being there, that presence is very, very valuable, and it's something that I am continually learning myself as well. One of the hard pieces of my job, some days I feel I got it and some days I don't.
Sure.
And I often get to the end of the day and I'll reflect back, was I really of any help here? But often it's those moments where I just sat there with the person, held their hand, gave them that reassurance that that things would be okay, and that they could rest in whatever whatever going through their mind at that moment. They could rest with it. And when they're ready to open up, they can open up. So Liz, I'll share with you this story that really kind of helped me to understand the value of just being there. This was an experience that I had when I was working with Hospice of Dayton. There was this gentleman. He was in him and his wife both resided in a assisted living facility. And when he was admitted to our services, he made it very clear that he did not want to see the chaplain. Well, I happened to be there in this facility one day seeing some other folks, and I thought, well, it's not going to hurt to just stop by his room, just say hi. So, I did that. And he wasn't real receptive, but he also didn't, turn me away. So then I made it a point, every time I was in that facility, I would stop by and say hi, and the conversations would grow a little bit more. Never talked religion, but just see how he's doing and what he was feeling that day. He was a very kind of a gruff man. He would give the nurses and social workers and others who would come in, he would give them a hard time, and suddenly they started coming to me saying, what's going on here? You go in there, he's nice to you, and he gives us such a hard time. And primarily one of his issues was he was just ready to die and have it over with, and that wasn't happening quick enough. So I kept going and building this relationship with this man. And as it turns out, when I was getting ready to leave Hospice of Dayton and come to work for Hospice of Central Ohio, he was still with us. And because of that special bond that I had made with him by just being there, I knew he was one that I had to make one last visit to. And so I went to see him my last week out there, and I told him, I said, now Bill, the day's the last day I will be seeing you. And I explained to him I had taken on a new role, a new job, and would be moving out of the area, but I wanted to be sure to stop in one last time and just to say hi. And as I was walking out of his room that day, I hear this response that comes back. He says, Dan, you're a good man. And that was his last word to me. And I went out of the building, got in my car, and that phrase just kept coming back to me, and I'm thinking, well, what was good about it? It was the fact that I was just there, and I kept coming back, even though he said he didn't want a chaplain. But when he learned that I was willing to just stop by and say hi and just be that gentle presence, not push him on any issues, but just be there. Right. And I often go back to that story and remind myself, that's what I'm called to do as a chaplain.
Is to be present. And what a beautiful benediction from him, a send-off for you, lest you doubt your abilities. And I think, and what a beautiful segue. I have one last question that I want to ask you, if you'll indulge us. One of the things that I think makes our care so effective at Hospice of Central Ohio is our willingness to grow as professionals, to be open to that in every situation, every encounter that we have, even when it's difficult, even when it's challenging, but also when it's rewarding and when it's easy. And I'm wondering if you could close off with anything that you'd want to share with us about what you've learned from your patients and how it has helped you become a better chaplain, a better person. And I'll let you take it from there.
That's a big question.
It is. It's huge. I realize
there's
that.
a lot that I learn, probably more so than sometimes I even realize. And I think too, with my story with Bill, there's so much that you learn about yourself as well, through the process of it all. I think one of the things though that just in general that patients teach us is to slow down, to take that time to listen, and to to truly listen, to listen with our hearts, and really, hear what, is being said, not only, verbally, but what is, being said through, body signs and other ways in which we hear.
Mm-hmm. And to let that be. Well, I don't know about our listeners, but I wish I had unlimited time to keep this going. How about if we gently extract a promise that you'll come back and do a part 2, because I made a lot of notes as we were talking that could take us in a lot of different directions about spiritual care. So Daniel, please know that you are welcome back in this podcast format for another opportunity to delve a little deeper into the spiritual aspect of end-of-life care, and I really appreciate you getting this conversation started for us. Thank you.
Yes, again, Liz, I thank you for inviting me to sit down and talk with you, and I'd be happy to come back and share more.
We would love it. When we come back, we'll be talking with Bob Coberly, another one of our full-time chaplains, and we'll focus in a little bit on the culture of care that we at Hospice of Central Ohio strive to create every day, and what the role of the chaplain is, and how attending to spiritual needs can help us create that culture. Thank you. We'll be back. There's a new year just around the corner. What a perfect time to join the Hospice of Central Ohio team by becoming a volunteer. From patient visits to office support, you can make a difference in so many ways. To learn more, contact Volunteer Services at 740-788-1404 or visit our website at www.hospiceofcentralohio.org. Perhaps 2017 will be the time to find new meaning and purpose in life. Join us. Welcome back to the second half of our podcast, talking about the spiritual care aspect of end-of-life care. And joining us for this half is Bob Coberly, chaplain for our Columbus team primarily, but I know you also serve patients in other parts of our service area. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Good to have you here. Bob, like we did with Daniel, to get started, please give us a little bit of background about what drew you into hospice chaplaincy.
What drew me into hospice chaplaincy really began long before I even knew what chaplains or end-of-life care was. And that is, as a teenager, I liked Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay.
I mean, I was fascinated with the way that he dealt with death and dying. Lenore and the Raven and the Pit and the Pendulum. I was just enamored by his writing, and as I grew older, I loved literature, so I moved on to people like Tolstoy with The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is a wonderful portrayal of families dealing with death and dying.
Right.
Particularly families that are they have problems, they disagree, they do strange things like a lot of families do, and they came out during that in their grief and in their struggling with it. And also the wonderful poems of Emily Dickinson. Do you remember, actually it would have been way back in the 90s, the movie The Piano?
Yes.
Okay, the theme song was written by Michael Nyman, I believe, and it's a beautiful piece of music, and they named it The Heart Asks Pleasure First. Okay. Which is an Emily Dickinson poem. It's inspired by that.
Right.
And in it, she describes the progression of death. And I consider it a hospice manifesto. Just a few simple words, but it's just wonderful. So I'm already beginning in my literature things to be interested in things about end of life, but I never thought about a profession, an occupation of working in end-of-life care in those years. And, while I went through college and got my degree, went through seminary, became a Presbyterian Christian minister. I was a pastor in congregations for about 9 years, and then I went into a residency program in South Bend, Indiana, Memorial Hospital, which was a clinical pastoral education program. And you may remember that's real important.
Sure.
Experience and credentialing that pastors need before they work in hospice.
Right.
Well, this was the year of it. It was a very good program. When I came out of it, I had a lot more doors to open than I did before that. However, when I finally got to where I found out about a job opening as a hospice chaplain, I entered it because I needed a job.
Right.
I mean,
Very simple.
It just happened to be that it was the right job, and it didn't take long for me to realize that. But that's kind of the course of getting there. And then I think in unconscious ways, all of those things, my fascination with end-of-life type issues when I was younger, the literature that brought it to a profound level, and then my work as a pastor and the training and experience, it all came together with hospice, and I've been doing it for 25 years now.
Okay. So with that tenure, what keeps you in hospice care? What is it that keeps you anchored in your work and here doing
I'd say
what you do?
two things. One of them is very selfish in a good way.
Yeah.
I feel like I am given so much meaning and purpose from the stories of patients, from the things they say and do in coping with this whole business of approaching death. The one thing I see, and it's a little bit different in everybody who goes through it, but people who are dying so often will come from real terrible fear of dying to a place where they're at peace with it, and it's so extraordinary. And so personally, I find it meaningful to continue to experience that. And also, I've come to see that for all of us in hospice, we really make a difference.
Yeah, we do.
In a genuine and real way, and that makes my life feel better, I think.
Okay. I'm going to pick up on something you said about we and all of us, because it's an aspect of hospice that I think it's easy for those of us within the hospice walls to take for granted, but it's the concept of team and how each of us has a role to play, and it's an interdisciplinary team. And so I guess where I'm leading this is how our organizational culture is all bent toward caring and bent toward being a culture that lives out that care every day. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more from your own experience about what the spiritual aspect of that care has looked like and why it's so important that we tend to those needs. We had asked Daniel that same question too, and just because you're different chaplains and you have different backgrounds, I'm just curious about the different stories you would have to tell. So why is it important that we're a culture of caring people?
Okay, let me begin by saying that all of us at hospice are there with a common purpose, and that has to do with not just taking care of people who are suffering and need the various professional and voluntary skills that are required to help people who are suffering, but also that profound element of these patients are approaching their death.
Right.
Okay, and so before I move on to trying to give some definition to hospice understanding of spirituality, let me say that we had talked about this whole business of culture of care, and a culture of care, it's like an umbrella under which all of us, an umbrella of purpose under which all of us work. And whether volunteer or administrative staff, or those of us who go to visit the patients, and the volunteers are among those also, some of them, all of us have different jobs and different skills. And yet all of us know in a simple way that we're contributing to the quality of care that our whole program gives to each of those patients. And so we all feel like we make a difference. And so it's a community and a team whose culture is a culture of care. And that simple idea, we all know that. We have a oneness and a family about that. I need not say any more. I think probably said too much to get there. But
No, not at all.
now, where does spirituality come in? Spirituality it's a word that means different things to different people, and all of those meanings are important. We often think about religion when we think about spirituality, because religion teaches us some traditional values and mores
Right.
that we put in the category of spirituality. And those things are all very important. Whether religious or not, there is a level of spirituality that people must reach on their own, because it really is personal. And I think that a general definition of it might be something like this. Spirituality is that intangible place and time where a person makes sense out of the experiences in their life.
Okay.
However, it is simpler than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Here's what I believe. Spirituality is relationships.
Okay.
Because it is only in a relationship where you trust someone enough to be vulnerable and talk about the things that are really important to you.
Mm-hmm.
It is only then that we understand the depth of what spirituality is. Let me tell a story.
Please do.
I was just starting. I literally had finished my orientation in my first hospice position many years ago. I'd been a pastor, but visiting people who were dying on a daily basis, I knew I was all starting over. I was green.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had been there for no more than a month. Okay? So this was all new. The patient was a 51-year-old woman. She had brain cancer. This was in Houston. She just got discharged from MD Anderson Cancer Center.
Mm-hmm.
The radiation and the chemotherapy that was directed toward the cancer in her brain literally had made her non-responsive.
Mm.
When she came home, discontinuing the radiation, discontinuing the chemotherapy because of the hospice purpose, she actually woke up.
Mm.
And within a few days was talking to people fairly appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So I'm going to visit her for the first time, and she wants me there. She told the nurse that. She is living in her parents' home, 51 years old, divorced, living in her parents' home. Her daughter lived a couple of hours away, and she came and moved in for the short term to help to take care of her mother.
Okay.
She's grown. So I get there, and very early in the conversation, the woman says, "Chaplain, I want to tell you what it's like to know that you're going to die."
Wow.
And part of me was just blown away, and part of me was just, I better be quiet and just listen.
Okay.
And she told me a number of what I call vignettes, things about she did with her grandchildren, people she loved. And I remember three of them clearly there, and I'll tell you those three. She said, my bed is right here where I am, downstairs. And in the morning, my dad comes downstairs, and before he goes out to his workshop in the back, he kisses me on the forehead, and he said, "I love you."
Mm.
Then she said, a little bit after that, my mother comes downstairs, and she says, "Good morning," with a sweet smile. And then a little bit after that, my daughter comes in the room with 2 cups of coffee. She helps me to sit up in the bed, and we sit and sip on the coffee and talk about nothing in particular. And then she looked at me and she said, "That is what I've learned in this process of approaching death, is that these moments are the most important moments in life." And she said, "I have missed him along the way so often. I was in such a hurry, in such a rush to succeed, to get somewhere, to accomplish things, to do the things we want to do in life, to really get what we think we want. And I've missed the things that were really, really, really important."
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what to say, and I didn't need to say anything. I probably said something really goofy.
That you can't recall at this moment.
I came
That's
away with
fine.
a story, and I think that says something about what I mean when I say spirituality is about relationships, because you don't tell those things to the wall.
Right. You're right.
You tell them to somebody you're in relationship with.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe it could be defined better, like relationships are the place where this happens. But I'd rather say that the relationships themselves are really spirituality. It's really where these important things happen.
Right.
Okay, so that's my first story.
Thank you. What a great story to kind of set up another part of our conversation. And as we talk, I'm sure we could go in 6 different directions. But when you talk about relationship, I think that's one of the things that can be challenging for anybody that's serving our patients, whether it's bedside or not. We talk a lot about the appropriateness of those relationships, about, you know, how we want to interact with our patients, how we want to interact with each other. And I'm wondering, as you look at the whole of your hospice experience, what are some things that we need to know as staff, whether we're paid or unpaid, about our own spirituality that might motivate us, that might come into the workplace, and how that impacts the way we carry out our mission? That's a big question. But what do we need to know about our own spiritual selves in order to do a better job serving our patients?
Okay, let me say that we are a relationship and service provider.
Right.
A service provider and relationships are a part of what we do. I would dare say that in dealing with persons who are approaching their death, we are more relationship oriented than other medical providers, even though that certainly is involved there. Hospice nurses talk about things that they do in hospice that they wouldn't do in other settings.
I've heard
how
that,
close
yes.
you get to the patients. So when we talk about how we treat each other, well, you're not just paying someone to do assembly line work. You're not just paying someone to provide a better income for your company. We're not, it's not. I think all jobs are important, and people need to love their work regardless of where they are. Our work is not more important, nor is it in any way better or worse than other jobs. But there is this part of us that needs to be genuine and relational with patients, so we need to treat each other in that way. That's what I meant when I said that as employers, the way we're treated by our employers should be based on a relationship that is much deeper than just a business as usual type approach.
Right.
I feel like I'm stumbling around, but I think the point's made.
Definitely.
And so when you ask about treating each other, well, I think that that's an important thing, and I think what I've seen in our company, that's understood, that if you want somebody to do a good job in providing a service like this, and to be genuine in their relationship, then you treat them that way. Now, it goes deeper. Under this culture of care umbrella that we have, that becomes a part of who we are.
Right.
And so our relationships with one another probably come pretty naturally. We probably don't even think about it. But you might say we treat other people the way we want to be treated. We treat the patients the way we think people ought to be treated, with respect and dignity, and so that kind of happens between us. I'm sure we fight.
Or at least disagree.
That's a part of relationships too.
Yes, it is. Yes,
so that's what I would say about that. That's what I thought when you brought up how do we treat one another.
Right. In some ways, I feel like it's this coin that has an outward face and an inward face, that we have the way
Good
that
way to put it.
And how are we seamless with the basic values of what makes us effective as good caring people in an end-of-life care setting. So the way that we get to practice at times with each other, because we've got a little more time with each other, because the stakes aren't quite so high, if I may, I think gives us a little bit of room to breathe into, hey, I think I'd like to do better at this. I've often heard that with our patients and families, we don't get a second chance to do it right. We have a small amount of time to build the kind of trust that we need to build in order to be effective. And so here's this dynamic that is really a continuum of care that includes how we take care of each other in the workplace, but also allows those lessons to go out the door to the people that we serve or to the people that we know. When people know that you're involved in hospice, what kind of reaction do you get, from people when you share that with them? As I'm a chaplain, I'm a hospice chaplain.
What kind of reaction do I get?
Yeah.
I think all of us in hospice get the same reaction. Not by everybody, but enough where we realize it's a social, I don't want to call it a problem necessarily, but it's interesting at least. And that is that comments like this, oh, that must be depressing. Oh, that must be hard.
Right.
I don't think many of us consider our work hard in the sense of hard work as we normally think of it. And I think we find enough purpose where although we get overwhelmed at times, depressing is not descriptive of what most of us feel. So
I would agree.
But we hear that often. We can expect it. Or we hear How about those Buckeyes?
Sure.
Because they want
Sure.
to change the subject.
Mm-hmm. Right.
People are afraid of grief, and
Mm-hmm.
and underneath all that, they're afraid of death, and we all are.
Right. And I would propose, based on my limited experience, that there are very few life events that call to the surface the things that matter most to us. And so at end of life, the things that matter most to us are going to magnify and rise and be fully present as much as they can be. The rest is going to fall away. I would also like to put out there that the things that we believe about ourselves as human beings, a relationship with something greater than ourselves, is also going to be at the core of that's going to matter. Has that been your experience as a chaplain, that you see people anchoring in a deeper spirituality as they get closer to the end, or what does that look like?
Well, again, the common thing that really thrills us as hospice providers is patients who move from being afraid of dying to being at peace with it, and it never seems to do anything but inspire us, and makes us feel good about being there. Very often it's not our doing, maybe more often than not, but we're there, and it's meaningful to be a part of it, if nothing more than being a companion along the way. I forgot what your question was. I got a little bit off, but I thought of that. What was the question again?
And maybe I probably won't state it verbatim, but how have you witnessed people focusing in on the spiritual aspect of their lives as they get closer to the end?
I did get off a little bit, except
That's
that
okay.
is a spiritual aspect, is finding peace. Well, that really comes partly into the religious aspect, because many people have a faith in God, and from their religious background, and in our society, most of those people, most of our patients will do that from a Christian point of view. So there is a comfort for them when they give you the right clues and they let you know this is where they are, that to offer them rituals and experiences of traditional faith experiences, prayer, and in fact, I very commonly in my prayers with the Lord's Prayer, simply because the phrases in that prayer are comforting to many people.
Sure.
I want to be familiar with their faith background. Sometimes that tells me things, not so much about rituals as questions to ask.
Very good.
The lady who was in the church choir and taught Sunday school both for 40 or 50 years, I realized that must be a real important part of her life. And in fact, it is expressed in her faith. In our documentation, even, there are questions about how this person, or how you help the person to express their faith in God. Okay, that this can be important for them, and it can be. And all of this is built into the ability to assess, to perceive when this is important to them, who this is important to. Some people are kind of angry at God. Some people have alternative belief systems. Some people will be offended if you presume that they want a religious experience. So you have to listen very closely. And I think, though, that most people, I think all people, have some type of profound and even vulnerable spiritual experience at end of life. Sometimes it's regret. Sometimes it's looking back and needing to say to someone, I really regret having done that, which might be guilt and forgiveness. It might be regret, whatever. It's kind of under the same category, and it's important for them to say that without being interrupted. And what I don't mean by that you don't engage them, you do, but our temptation is to say, God loves you and forgives you. And when you say that, you're really not feeling the pain that this person is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
You're telling them that it's not as painful as you say that it is.
Okay.
Because it can be forgiven.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that people, when they're talking about the vulnerable things in their life, they want to know that somebody understands what the pain is.
Yes.
Before they
Agreed.
get in a hurry to take it away from them. Usually we take it away from them with whatever words we use. God loves you, God forgives you.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to feel that way, it's over with. Usually we say those things because we're uncomfortable with the pain ourselves.
Exactly.
And at some point, even though we need to move past that too, but at some point they need to hear that, yeah, somebody understands. I've got a patient who is bipolar and has all kinds of problems with depression and things. And I said to him once, you go through so much.
Right.
It's just incredible. I don't know how you make it. It just sounds so overwhelming. And his eyes lit up and he said, you cannot know how good it feels to hear someone recognize that. And it was, it's not that I did something right. It's that
Right.
at that moment it worked. And he said to me something I've kind of known all along, is that people want to be understood and they want their pain to be recognized.
Right.
I dare say a lot of people, even with the people closest to them, sometimes they feel like the care for the pain they're going through isn't as strong, and somebody needs to see it. And that's one aspect. It's not everything we do, but I think that's important.
And I agree, because everything, as I'm listening to you talk, Bob, seems to me to point to our, and I'm just going to use these words because they're coming to me, the sacred obligation to build spiritual trust among the people that come to us in a vulnerable way, because they're already vulnerable physically, they're vulnerable emotionally and physically, and so we validate their experience by listening. I think
Trust
the challenge,
is the key word.
Trust is the key word.
Okay,
I would agree.
Let me
please do.
pontificate for a moment.
By all means, that's what it's a podcast of pontification.
Okay.
Go.
Yeah, every seminarian at some point learns it, that in the biblical languages, the word trust, the word faith, the word belief, they're all the same word.
Okay. Yeah.
Which makes sense. You trust God when you believe in God.
Right.
But the word itself is used in different contexts, and in one place it's trust, in one place it's belief, but it is actually the same word.
Right.
So the moment of trusting someone with something important to you, something vulnerable, is a spiritual moment.
Yes, it is.
Whether it's trusting God or trusting you, sometimes I think it's harder to trust you as a human being.
I would
more
agree.
vulnerable.
I would agree.
Let me move into one thing. I think it's in the middle of some of this is the element of surprise. And what I mean by that is we are trained in the area of spiritual care with certain skills.
Okay.
And all hospice staff to some degree are trained in them. It has to do with listening. And particularly this phrase, this term we call active listening. It's really quite important. And it's something we do in a moment. We listen to what someone's saying. We try to reflect on it to let them know we heard them, and it's a skill level thing. Okay?
Sure.
We think it helps them to feel like somebody cares and that. However, in the process of this, we're also taught about the things that can be going on: guilt, fear, particularly feelings. And we think people need to express their feelings, and they do, but often we create an agenda before we approach them. This person was kind of afraid last time. Maybe we could help them by letting them talk about it. And so, the surprise element that I spoke of is that sometimes these skill level things help us to get to the point where the person we're talking to, usually the patient, suddenly is able to share something with you. And it may be totally different than what your agenda was. But if you go in with an agenda, you may not hear it.
Exactly. I agree.
So so here's an example. Sometimes, maybe more often than we think, the patient spiritually will find a way to do what they need to do because the the potential for that was already there. I think the Wizard of
Okay.
Oz was right.
You always
Everybody-
had the power to
Everybody
go on.
always
Sure.
had the things that Oz gave to them.
Right, right,
Oz didn't give the Tin Man what he didn't already have.
right.
That's a rock and roll line,
It
by
is. I think it's America.
the way. It is.
We'll do a fact check on that later.
It is America.
Okay.
So, now I forgot everything I was talking about. No. That's my spiritual crisis, is absent-mindedness.
It's about going in with your own agenda, you
Okay,
were
so
saying, and
I
that you'll
have this.
miss it.
Yes, I have this patient who is afraid of dying.
Mm-hmm.
He would never tell me that because he didn't want to talk about either issue.
Okay.
He liked me and he wanted me to visit him weekly. He was about 75 years old or so,
Mhm.
okay? And his wife is very concerned that he doesn't want to talk about it. And what I do see though, and it's clear, is that he's anxious, he's afraid, he's
Mhm.
very, it's deeper than sad. He just has this lingering shadow about him. And so we talk about things. We talked about the Houston Astros and the Rockets and all the things guys talk about, and
Mhm.
they're important things, but I knew that we really weren't talking about what he was struggling with. So then one day I call ahead and I get the wife and I said, I want to come visit. She said, oh yeah, why don't you come visit? And when you get here, ask him about his dream.
Oh.
So,
Huh.
and she's got this bright sound in her voice, like something's changed. And so I get there and and it didn't take long. I asked him about the dream and he said, well, I don't know if you want to hear that. And I said, I think I do. So he tells me his dream. In the dream, he's riding on a motorcycle, and his friend Michael is riding on a motorcycle with him. I need to explain something ahead so you understand what's going on in the dream. Michael was his friend back when they were in their 20s. They lived across the Louisiana border. They rode their motorcycles an hour or two into Texas to Houston where they had jobs. They were together because of this. They were together a lot. They were best friends, and they rode their bikes together. So in the dream, he's talking to Michael. Oh yeah, Michael died 20 years before this. He's already dead. Okay? So my patient then says he's riding on his motorcycle with Michael. They're talking to Michael, and as he's going, he kind of pauses, and I said, well, how are you feeling? They're riding this bike with Michael, and he said, well, let me tell you this. Michael said to me, and we're on the bikes, and he turned his head over to look at me, and he said, it's going to be okay. And he didn't tell me any more about the dream. As far as he was concerned, that was the end of the dream. And after that, he talked about what was happening in his life. Every visit, he talked about death. He talked about peace. His expression changed. Just remarkably. He found peace with life and peace with his approaching death. And it took this dream for this close, intimate friend to tell him from the other side of death that it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
Now, there's nothing I could have said to help him find his way. There's nothing any of us could have done. He found his way with this dream.
Right.
And
Right.
a relationship with an old friend. But,
Huh.
so, the element of surprise is real important. Surprise for me in this case means sometimes the best things that can happen are what we get to because we've been patient and we've trusted the process, if you would, of hospice and death and dying, end of life,
Right.
and allow for things to surprise us.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do that, we might really understand the real personal things that people need to get out better than thinking that if they just talk about their fear, if they just talk about their faith, if they just confess their sins, if they do this, if they do that, that somehow this will make everything all right in their spiritual journey.
Right.
It may or may not, but something surprising, you realize that's what needed to happen.
Your story, Bob, and thank you. What a wonderful way for all of us listening, whether it's paid staff, volunteer staff, the community. This podcast is touching all of those aspects to remind ourselves that, this isn't about us. This is about the patient. And we know we say it, and it's easy, okay, intellectually I can comprehend that, but to take it to the deepest level of what am I here to provide? What am I here to do for someone in hospice, wherever my station is, wherever my work area is, how can I make it not about me today? And not that that's, I mean, we have well-intentioned, we all need those reminders to recalibrate, who's this for? And I get this image in my head of the patient and the family in the center of a bunch of concentric circles, and all of us facing in that direction. And periodically we need to face each other to go, I need support, or can I debrief with you? We get that. We understand all of that. But to actually have that moment where we remember what we're here for. And I think when we talk about, and I'm come back kind of full circle, when we talk about creating that organizational culture of caring, I think that's what we're talking about, is we're focused in that one direction, paying attention to those details without forgetting ourselves completely, because self-care is important, but knowing that this is what we're all working toward.
Can I offer a very short poem?
Please.
I mentioned literature and sight,
great.
and I love it.
Mm-hmm.
It's W.H. Auden, who was an English poet, and it's just 3 lines. It's almost a haiku. And in it he says, he still loves life, but oh, how he wishes the good Lord would take him. That one foot in this world, one foot in the next, that tension between the two, and we see that as a part of our work so often.
Wonderful.
If not with the patient, with the family.
Wonderful. So to wrap up this session, what advice would you give to people that are considering hospice as a place to work or volunteer?
2 things. One, I would say, be aware of who you are. Be aware of what interests you about hospice, and be aware of your own issues, your grief, your anger at the world, the things you love. Because if you work with people as we do in hospice, if you're not aware of those issues that trouble you, you'll tend to bring them into the conversation. You won't even know you did it. I dare say we all do to some extent, but it's a real important quality for a person in healthcare work in particular, but anyone in the whole area of the helping services, that it is not about us, it's about them. And the way we make it about us is because we're needy at times. And so be aware. If you're aware of what your issues are and you're talking to people you trust about it, then it helps a lot. And be aware of why you want to come into hospice. If you want to come into hospice because you think you have some ability to lead persons to be saved, go work with the church. That's important work, but that really is the ministry of religion and your particular religion. It's very important, but in hospice, that can get in the way because it's an agenda that is really hard to let go of and allow the patient to tell you what they need.
Right.
We do have patients that tell us we want to be forgiven. We want to do all that. We want to go through the rituals but they tell us, and we understand it, and we're always ready to give them just what they ask for. It's important to be able to listen to them and again be surprised by what they may have to offer us. If we're there for reasons that we think we can change them in any way, maybe we shouldn't be working in hospice.
Sage advice.
I think that's real important.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that's what we see quite a lot in terms of our approach, is that taking people as they are, welcoming them, and encouraging folk who are interested in approaching hospice as a career or as a volunteer opportunity to be aware of that deep sense of what we can provide by simply letting people be who they are.
Yeah, and it's not an easy thing to say that you should not be in hospice if you're there to change people or to do something to them, because everything that they're talking about when they talk about wanting to change people, wanting to fix their problems or whatever,
right?
It's real important to you, talking to that person.
Yeah.
But we really need to be able to let go of all that and listen to the patient.
Agreed. Well, Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. There's so much more here. I believe we probably will do a part 2, 3, 4. We'll get Daniel to come back. We have yet to hear from Mark Pierce. If you are interested at all in discussing volunteer opportunities, I encourage you to give our Volunteer Services Department a call at 740-788-1404, or visit us on our website at www.hospiceofcentralohio.org. And this concludes our 4th Listen and Learn podcast. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.